I think a lot of people are here. Okay, I'm Kat Parnell, and I want to welcome all of you to Birchbark Editing's InConversation series. My co-founder, Max Fraser, is somewhere on your screen, and we run Birchbark. Not only do we host events, but we offer a wide variety of editing and coaching services. So if you need something, any editorial services, do give us a shout. As always, your support for this free reading service series is appreciated. You'll see, if you look at your screen, I'm sure it's in gallery view, that we are doing an open gallery this evening so that you can see your fellow book lovers. We just want to create this sense of community, and visuals are one of the best ways to do that. So take a look at all the pictures, feel free to have private conversations with people, but do mute your mic. We are recording the event this evening. Use the chat to say hello. Let us know where you're logging in from. And can you hear me?
Yeah.
Share your, please use the chat to let us know where you're logging in from, and share any thoughts, comments, or enthusiasm about our two writers for this evening. And now let me introduce our guests. Two women I have long admired and followed with great interest. Martha Cooley is the author of Buy Me Love and two other novels, The Archivist, a national bestseller published in a dozen foreign markets, and 33 Swoons, and a memoir, Guesswork. I strongly recommend that. Co-translated Time Ages in a Hurry. Her essays, short fiction, and co-translations have appeared in numerous leading literary journals. She just retired after years with Adelphi University, where she was one of the directors of the MFA program in creative writing. And prior to Adelphi, she taught for 15 years in the Bennington Writing Seminars. She lives in Forest Hills in Queens, New York, and she's headed to Italy soon, where she's going to take up residence. Deirdre McNamer is the author of Aviary and of 4 other novels. Her first, Rima in the Weeds, won the Pacific Northwest Bestsellers Association Award. One Sweet Quarrel and My Russian were both New York Times Book Review Notable Books of the Year. Red Rover was named to the Best Books of the Year lists of many, many publications. She's the recipient of an Artist Innovation Award from the Montana Arts Council, and her work has been published in, again, leading literary magazines. She was a visiting writer at Cornell, the University of Oregon, the University of Alabama, and Williams, before joining the MFA faculty of the University of Montana's creative writing program in 1995. She taught there until 2020 and now holds a faculty position with the Bennington Writing Seminars MFA program. She lives in Missoula, Montana, with her husband, Brian DeSalvatore. So the way things will go this evening is our guests will read from their books a bit and talk about it, and they will discuss women on the verge and the writing process. So again, please post your questions in the chat. Martha, Deirdre, welcome to Birchbark Editing Series.
Thank you, Kat.
Thank you, Kat. It's just so great to be here. Thanks to everyone for being here. Thank you, Deirdre, whom I finally get to meet on screen, though not yet in person. And as Kat mentioned, Deirdre and I have the Bennington Writing Seminars in common as well. And there's a few people from there in the audience, and that makes me happy too. So thanks to everyone. It's really great to be here. Deirdre and I were talking before this began about our books and about what we might want to sort of start off thinking about together in this conversation. And one thing that came to mind instantly was the sense we both had that because our books took some time to be made, they began or seemed to begin as one sort of story and then went through a kind of morphing process where other things came into play, other things were implicated in the stories, and that was an excitement for us and took us on a particular kind of journey. So it might be lovely, Deirdre, for you to start by reading a bit, and then we can kind of develop this notion of what our books began as and what they began to turn toward or into. And in the course of that conversation, I'm sure much else will arise, but I'd sure love to hear you.
Okay, thank you, Martha. It's just a pleasure to read with you. I loved your book and immediately felt several affinities between them. And we'll talk more about that. But as Martha said, each of them starts with an event to kind of, mine is a sort of, looks like a conventional whodunit almost. There's a fire in an old people's apartment building, and there's a quasi-detective, a fire inspector who's charged with finding out if it was arson or not. So because he's the main character, his name is Lander Mackey, and I'm just going to introduce him for just a few brief pages here. So he gets this call about the fire and is driving in his 1972 Volvo over there that he got his Volvo on eBay. Shortly after the dispatcher's call, Mackey drove in his customary manner toward Pheasant Run, which meant that it took him quite a long time to cover the 2 miles. He liked to remind himself as he drove that the Volvo moved along the floor of an ancient lake, stupendously large, and that the mountains that began at the edge of the houses still bore the watermarks of that lake's levels during several glacial dramas that had drained and refilled the valley time after time. Mountains as ancient shores. He found the idea oddly comforting. Mackey moved at a near crawl because he felt that slowness, too, had become so rare as to seem almost extinct. By proceeding in a hushed and unhurried manner whenever he could, he felt like a scientist reintroducing a threatened species to its old habitat. The pace also helped him think, or rather it prepared him to think in the way that he knew he would have to in order to know what he was seeing at the fire site, or not seeing. That was the essence of fire investigations. You had to put together a scenario from the presence of an absence. The art was in imagining what had been taken away and how that might have happened. He rolled down the window and practiced his smelling. Rhonda liked to tell him that his exceptional olfactory gifts, his hyperosmia, made him almost a dog, and his twitching nostrils knew it to be true. Here were the cacophonous smells of a late autumn morning in a rocky mountain valley populated by 70,000 souls. Evergreens, car exhaust, river water, just to record the top notes. It was several degrees warmer than normal, though the new normals made such comparisons increasingly irrelevant. And this November had the added strangeness of the leaves that had remained on the trees after that lacerating early October freeze. Mackey could smell them too. They were crisp, but more vegetal than papery. They evoked a particular kind of dried mushroom, quite possibly enoki. There was also in the air the smell that was the absence of snow during what used to be snow season. It was a faint, grave-like smell, chilled and dense. So that's a little bit about Mackey and his fabulous nose. Martha's book, the event that happens in the early part of it is a woman who wins a lottery ticket for a multi-million-dollar purse. And so I think she's going to read a little bit about that person, Ellen, going to the little bodega and buying her ticket.
I am, but I want to say first how delightful it is to hear that section with our detective and his nose, which puts us in place. And I think in both these novels, the place in which the action unfolds is extremely important. In my case, it's Brooklyn, New York. And obviously in Deirdre's case, it's a very different environment. There's a town, and then there's the natural world around, which the novel is extremely attuned to. And the renderings of the natural world are one of the greatest pleasures, and of animals. And we should talk about animals, Deirdre.
Lots of animals in these books.
Yeah, we should really talk about animals and what the kind of work that animals are doing in these novels, which I think is not inconsiderable. But yes, I'll read this brief section in which Ellen, this is the year 2005, goes into this shop and without intending to, buys a ticket. And I should also say that the numbers that she bets are her childhood phone number, which she happens to have seen written on a piece of paper that's sort of been pinned under a grate on the sidewalk by a draft of air coming up from the subway. And the subway is also a fairly major feature in this book. So there's these sort of serendipities, as there are also in Deirdre's novel. The question of chance and its operations in human lives is, I think, really up in both of these books. So here's Ellen in Brooklyn. Jaywalking across 6th Avenue, Ellen opened the bodega's brass-handled door. Ah, that scent, with an overlay of freshest coffee. The proprietor, a short, oval-faced man, raised both hands in greeting. The dog by the register raised its head for a moment, then dropped back to sleep. Morning, the proprietor said in a gruff, cheerful voice. Morning, Mr. Reyes. He gestured in the direction of the avenue she had just crossed. A car sat in the middle of the intersection, waiting to turn. Immediately behind it, a beat-up black Lincoln honked aggressively. Car services, idiots, those drivers. Why can't Brooklyn have regular taxis like in the city? The Lincoln's driver leaned out of his window and began yelling at the driver ahead of him. Mr. Reyes clucked his tongue. One of these days, he said, you're going to walk against that light and get mowed down. Those guys can't drive to save their own lives. Oh, I'll be fine, but thanks for worrying about me. Your usual, he reached for the coffee pot. Please, and one of those cookies your wife makes. They're so good. I haven't put them out yet. First, have some of this. He handed her a paper cup filled to its brim. She sipped cautiously. Hot, strong, reassuring. She fished a $10 bill from her pocket and handed it over. Anything smaller? Asked Mr. Reyes. Oh, sorry, hang on a sec. Reaching into her bag, she pulled out her wallet, attempting to open it with one hand while stabilizing her coffee with the other. Put that cup down, said Mr. Reyes. You're going to spill all over yourself. Setting the cup on the counter, she spread open her billfold and walked the tip of her forefinger through its contents. No singles, just larger bills. No dice. I went to the bank last night and all I've got are 20s. Rich lady, eh? Mr. Reyes chuckled. I wish. You could be. What, rich? Yeah, you should play this new lottery game. Win big time, really big. Like what? Like 100 million, he smiled. That's the jackpot. She sipped more coffee. But I never play. I mean, I've never even bought a lottery ticket. Too complicated, all those rules. Complicated? Nah, it's easy. You just pick 7 numbers, see? The printed form he handed her had 7 empty squares in the middle. Tiny text swarmed across the white spaces above and below the squares. Squinting, she reached into her bag in search of her reading glasses. Mr. Reyes pointed to something like a cash register sitting on the counter near the dog, a modest white box with a small keyboard. Don't bother reading anything on that form, he said. It's all automated. All you got to do is pay your dollar and pick your numbers. They can be single or double digits. It doesn't matter. I'll punch them into that little machine and you check your TV tomorrow to see if you're the winner. I don't own a TV. Really? His brows rose. You don't get bored? I do get bored. That's why I don't own a TV. He laughed. Well, I can't make it through a day without watching a little soccer. Plus the news, you know, if something should happen. If something should happen, I've got a radio, so I'd know. Yeah, sometimes I wonder why we need to see everything. Who wants to watch buildings fall down over and over? Exactly. Or car bombings, suicide attacks. We've got ourselves into quite the mess over there, Mr. Reyes, haven't we? Hard to believe we've been at war over 2 years already. Iudanos, listen, you really should try the new lottery. It's called Pick 7. These crazy times we live in. I just have this feeling one of my customers is going to win big. I'll even say a prayer for you. She laughed. Who will you pray to, Mr. Reyes? A divine figure, of course, Jesus, Muhammad, Buddha. I rotate them each week. Today's Monday. I have to check my calendar. You rotate them, really? He nodded earnestly. To increase the odds, he said. Look, buy a ticket and bring in your numbers tomorrow. That's when the drawing is. I'll tell you if you're a winner. Even if you don't win the jackpot, they're giving out lots of smaller prizes. Wouldn't you like a few extra grand in your bank account? Or a trip to Barbados with your boyfriend? He smirked in a friendly, non-lascivious way. Ha, she said, right, my boyfriend, Casper the Friendly Ghost. Well, escaping to Barbados by yourself wouldn't be so bad, would it? The coffee had cooled to just the right temperature, a reprieve, a few instants in the seat of happiness. The lottery form, 7 empty boxes waiting to be filled in. You'll get a cut if I win, right? You bet, Mr. Reyes's smile elongated, revealing a pair of gold-capped incisors. All right then, here's a buck. Pray to whomever you like. I'll take whatever help I can get. He grinned, gold teeth glinting. You'll get it. Oh, your cookie. Wait, I almost forgot. I wouldn't let that happen. So that is my one of my characters, Ellen, whose story interweaves with another woman's, a younger woman named Blair. Ellen is in her 50s, and she's a poet who feels failed as a poet. And Blair is an artist, a visual artist, a street artist, does her work on the street, works with sort of ephemera in mind and invisibility in mind. So she's occupying a certain kind of space in this story that's very different from Ellen's. And their lives do eventually start to approach one another. One of the things that Deirdre and I did talk about was this question of managing a rather large ensemble cast. So as we were sort of starting these books that seemed, in Deirdre's case, to be a detective story, and mine about someone wins the lottery, and then morph into and involve other matters, chance, occasions for change, certainly money and the insecurities attendant to that, particularly for women. Deirdre has several characters for whom money is a very challenging matter, and greed is a big deal. I'd love to hear you talk about that a bit, Deirdre, about money and chance and how they're figuring in your story.
Sure. Well, elderly people, many elderly people live day to day with money anxieties, of course. Well, lots of people do. But in your older years, you don't have the options available to you to pick another career, you can't count on your health. There's just 3 or 4 or 5 extra layers of fragility, it seems to me, just per se, being in an older population regarding money. And I think that in the last half a decade, all of us, many of us, have become really aware and concerned that money has been enshrined as a central value of this country, basically. If you have money and you wield power via having money, that's sort of the value system that's displayed and has been in place to a greater extent, it seemed to me, than at many other earlier times in my life. And so I think as that solidified and I was taking care of elderly parents and going to some place pretty often in which everybody was on a fixed income, not many had very much money, the combination of the people I met sort of day in, day out, and the larger sort of cultural orientation of this country in our times really disturbed me quite a lot. And the willingness of it seemed more and more, anybody who lived on an edge financially, or you were in the, any kind of group that didn't enjoy unquestioned power of some kind or another just is very close to being thrown under the bus. I felt in recent years, especially. So I know that fueled me was anger about in part, the role of money and the value attached to having it and wielding it at but also, I think that, well, that's all I'll say about money for the moment. I'm curious about, I mean, yours is money from the beginning. And what would you do if you had a ton of money, like lots of money? And what's interesting, I think, about your book, Martha, is that the problem of what to do, I mean, how so much money might alter your very being and your way of being in the world starts to take over as the big concern, not who you're going to give it to or what they're going to do with it. And so that was fascinating to me when you made that turn.
Yeah, well, thank you. I mean, I certainly knew early on I didn't want to write about, okay, she wins a lot of money and then how does she spend it? That would just, to me, be extremely dull. Just not a story at all. But I was interested in the kinds of psychological and emotional pressure that someone would be put under when they are aware that, you know, things are going to change in this profound and radical way. And they're meant to think that this will bring happiness, relief, etc. And in Ellen's case, she's not entirely convinced. She can't get herself fully on board. So part of what I did as the story began to focus much more on her interior life and on what kinds of opportunities were opening up to her that really didn't have to do with winning the ticket, but with the very pressure that she was under. I started thinking a lot about time, about money and time. And I feel like your novel too puts your characters under a kind of time pressure. One's aware that, you know, this arson has to be resolved, the mystery of it. There's a question of whether Pheasant Run will be sold and what that will do to the people living in it. So there's not endless time, not to mention that these are old people. So tick tock, they don't have forever. So I think that that's where the sort of rubber meets the road, as it were, with the tension and the suspense in both novels, that it's not actually about the fire per se or the winning lottery ticket per se, but the kinds of, as I say, the pressures, the opportunities, the chance things that arise in this kind of interregnum when things are not clear. The ticket has not been redeemed in my book. You know, the arson has not been, the culprit has not been found, if culprit indeed it is. And so within that space of uncertainty arises a lot of human condition that, you know, in your case, I'm just so amazed and delighted by the various lives we encounter and how quickly you sketch, how you limn these people, L-I-M-N, as in just sort of draw their contours, their borders. And yet deep within, we feel we have access to something that's essential to their kernel. And you bring a bunch of them in, including a couple of young people who are really fascinating players in all this. So, you know, maybe it would be cool for us to talk a little bit about that, about managing a bunch of different fates kind of set into play here.
Yeah, I think you have Blair, who is a young woman, very much, she's very much not moving in the milieu that the other characters are. She's an outlaw of a kind. She's an artist. She doesn't have any money. Her family has pretty much given up on her, and she has a very troubled brother who may or may not be living, that she keeps referring to in her head. He's her reference point. And I have a character, he's younger, he's 15, he's drugged, he's gone to about 5 different shrinks for sort of inappropriate and obsessive compulsive behavior and fury, and his family is breaking up, and, you know, just lots of elements that are making him something of a wreck as well, and on the outside. And that character for me, my question is, when did Blair show up? Because you have such a handle on, I mean, clearly, you know, the life of Ellen and her friends, her nearest and dearest. It's just a wonderful group of people that she, you know, she's got a pattern in her life, and you know, they share interests, and they're adults, and they have some history behind them. And then you have this wildcat Blair running in and out, and I've got my wildcat boy running in and out. And I'm curious what you think that character adds to an ensemble sort of storytelling performance.
Yeah, it's such a great question. And you have Clayton, but you also have Raven, you know, the
Raven, the bird girl, yeah.
After, who also plays a, you know, she's a kind of escape artist, and we'll just leave it.
Right.
And she's delightful. And I think in my case, the middle-aged characters needed a kind of countervailing force, both in terms of age and in terms of just basic nature. And Blair is indeed quite an outlaw, and willing to take quite a few risks in her art, in her thinking and feeling. And she's extremely isolated and alienated too. And so that in that way, she has something sort of somewhat in common with Ellen, who is aware of her status as a woman living alone, single. She's got a couple of lovers, but she hasn't had a partner in quite a while. And into her life comes the possibility of a romantic attachment. And that I needed to bring that into play to open up this question of chance and take the what if in a different direction. But Blair is at the same time intervening without without Ellen's realizing it, but intervening in the world as Blair sees such interventions, following the dictums as she hears them or reads them of Albert Camus, who she kind of has a very strange relation to. She kind of cherry picks from his philosophy, and she does these art interventions that she wants to be very provocative and troublesome. She wants them to be troublesome. So I felt like trouble had to come from a different sort of nature and a different sort of character altogether. But the commonalities with Ellen and Blair have to do with needing money, being under pressure, not having a lot of time to sort some stuff out, and being open to risk, but in quite different ways as it happens. So that was me. I wonder about you. You put also Clayton in relation to one of the older residents in a way that I just found delightful and moving. So there's that kind of crossover of ages too in your book.
Right. Yeah. I wonder if maybe on some level, both of us created these characters with no net, really. They're out there, and they're potentially in danger. They're not solid. They're not, they don't have a lot of, they don't have stable conditions, and they also have their own furies to contend with. I'm just thinking of this right now, but I think maybe I wanted a character like that as a way to sort of subtly plant the idea that maybe the other characters who seem more, sort of more in a pattern, have lived long lives and so on, are also without a net in some ways. So that you look at it obviously without a net character, and a reader does, and it can make you, it just plants that idea of sort of free floating existentially. And I don't know if that's why I created her, but and Clayton, the boy, but I also wanted to, I think, set up some kind of connection between, in my case, teenagers and the very old, quite old. The older woman Clayton comes to know this older woman in this building, Cassie McMacken, and she really needs somebody to need her. She needs somebody to help in her life. She needs to feel that she can help somebody in her life. Because I think that's one of the sad drifts of certain kinds of old age, is that you're not useful to anybody anymore. Nobody needs you very much. And he kind of, in effect, brings her back from a psychological brink that she's on herself, because she becomes aware of his need for her at that point in his life. So that didn't come for quite a while, but I think that when you work on novels like this with a lot of characters, and you work on them for a long time, which both of us did, you maybe you come to appreciate the undercurrents of relationships in a way that you might not if you're just trying to get that plot down the road, and make these characters function well within a story that you've decided is pretty much in place in your head anyway. And this was a completely different experience for me than some other books that I've written, which is that I didn't know what I was doing for years with this book. I was just writing sections. trying to make the characters a little deeper on. And I really thought it was pretty much of a failure for quite a few years. And then having gotten to know them well enough, I started to see how they could interact in a way that I found interesting and potentially gratifying for a reader. Did that happen to you?
Yeah, you've articulated really nicely my own experience. I mean, there were times when I never felt I was actually going to give up, but where the frustration was huge, and I had to just keep being with the people, and then starting to see, as you said, these undercurrents that were characterological, but that also helped me play with this notion of chance, which, in fiction workshops, you're told too many coincidences is a bad thing, but our lives are full of them, and that's a reality. So I wanted to try to sort of think about how people improvise their way through lives that toss coincidences at them, toss chances, opportunities, risks, hazards at them, and turns, switches, being on the verge. These things occur naturally in our lives, and we don't sort of train ourselves to track them. But in making a story, and being a fiction writer and making a story, one has to corral that somehow. Otherwise, it is one of Henry James's loose baggy monsters. It doesn't cohere. So you want to try to figure out a way to frame these things. And I do think in both our novels that time, we did have to work with a sense of a limited time, not years and years and years. And that was part of how we each seemed to manage this growing sense we were having of, I see, there are these kind of swells of feeling and thought animating these characters, almost as if it were a sea moving under them, and just sort of tracking those motions and seeing what can we do with that? How can we kind of keep the book moving forward, have that sense that you're sailing forward, but not having it seem contrived or concocted.
I think that's a really good point about keeping your time frame discrete, especially if you have a lot of characters. Because one mistake I was making for a while was offering way too much backstory of some of these characters. Like one of the residents of this building lived in an internment camp on the edge of Missoula, and during World War II. He was an Italian the boat was interdicted in Panama, and they were rushed off to Ellis Island and rushed out to Montana, and it all really happened. And it's quite fascinating, but I just went on way too long in an earlier version of his what he was like as a young man on this ship. And it was starting to weight the whole book toward another, it was an invitation to think about another time entirely than the time frame of where the real drama is happening ultimately in the book as it turned out. And so, but I didn't remind myself of that early enough. And somebody did tell me that, a teacher a long time ago, just saying, it's an anxiety producing project to write a novel anyway. And then if you're going to try to manage a bunch of different characters, at least keep the time frame pretty discreet, because then you don't have to think about that as another huge element that you have to manage several decades of time on the page. So I'm really responding to that. Yours is a pretty short time frame. Mine is basically a couple of months and then a jump over at the end to a little more than a year later, but it's not very much time.
Yeah, and I think that, as you say, that helps sustain tension and keep the writer and thus the reader focused on, all right, what are the stakes as they mount here for the central characters. And you braid deliciously the secondary characters into the narrative so that they arise and they appear in just the right moments at just the right time to give us some additional dimension of the problems that the ensemble as a whole are encountering, which are problems of money, problems of aging, problems of meaning, of finding meaning, and problems of loss, which arise in my book as well, because several people have sustained traumatic losses, and that muddies and complicates their response to the world. Mm-hmm. And I feel like this might be a moment, just I'm aware of time as well here passing, and so I know we want to get to the point where people can ask questions, but I did want to bring up the notion of animals in our work, Deirdre. This came up in a conversation I had last night with the writer Anne Germanicos, who mentioned that there are dogs and cats in my novel, and yours has just these riveting descriptions of animals really imperiled in ways that are just, I don't want to spoil this for the reader, but there's some very anguishing but really important depictions of humans' effects on the natural world in this setting that speak to the larger question of greed, of corporate greed, of national greed. My animals in my book are deployed somewhat differently. They're kind of markers of aloneness and of identity, but I didn't realize till I was asked about this, like, gee, yeah, those animals they are kind of doing some work. So I wondered about you and the animals in yours.
Well, somebody asked me that question fairly recently, a writer friend, and so I had to think about it a little bit, and I started leafing through, and there's just animals everywhere, one kind or another. They're just creeping in, and I want, why? I mean, I love animals, but I didn't intend to foreground them or anything. And it occurred to me, and this sounds kind of peculiar, but part of what I think I was trying to talk about in this book was a kind of realm that is that old age is, which is not the day-lit, busy, agenda-filled world so much. You're moving to some edge of things. And the edge of things is kind of where the animals start. I mean, animals are roaming around in this neighborhood right at the beginning of the book. They're on the edges of the day. Their whole big, busy life is apart from humans. There are interactions, of course, but the idea of just a really humming world that is animals used as a way to talk about where one might be moving as an old person, getting sort of more and more toward the edges of of a busy life with a big future ahead, busy human life, might be part of it. But also I'm thinking of another peculiar thing. You have this great character in your book, Wynne, who is the brother of Ellen, and he's a kind of troubled genius musician who has stopped notating music because he basically hears it everywhere. But he said the world was an orchestra playing nonstop. And so he draws on that for his sense of human existence has to do with this buzzing other, sounds making, just populating the book in a very alive sort of way. And when I read that, I thought, well, that's somewhat akin to what I was trying to get at, I think, with all the animals. Is it, in fact, I have an actual animal communicator in my book, who thinks she can look at a photo of an animal and you send advice and the animal will, just telepathically, and the animal will behave better. But I don't know. I think part of what I was after was that you're also closer to death and closer to when you're old, and maybe more conscious of, is there kind of a big hum running beneath, busy daylit life that I should have maybe apprehended, or I want to apprehend now. And I don't think that that's necessarily a strictly religious impulse, but it's close maybe. And it happens with the music, with Wynne, and I think it might happen, I hope it does to some extent, with the animals out there in the night in my book.
Yeah, that makes total sense. And there's such beauty in the way you do the animals and the natural world as a whole. And listening to you, I found myself, the word metamorphosis comes to mind. I mean, as your very elderly characters approach death, they are going to, inevitably shift their physical self. When it leaves, it will be transformed into something else. We know that as a matter of science, regardless of whether we have religious or spiritual beliefs about what exactly that entails. But the animal world represents this ever present, like you said, humming with life and vitality, and the elderly are shifting into a realm that puts them adjacent to that world in a different and new way. Gives them time to be quiet, like your character right at the beginning. The detective, says, I like the hush when I slow down, when I listen. And my composer too is very interested in music as also something in his head. He has tinnitus, so he hears the sounds of his own consciousness. His head makes noises that he can actually then draw. So these metamorphoses in my book are also sort of transferals of meaning among art forms, going from the visual to the oral, A-U-R-A-L, to the written. These characters are sort of all immersed in the possibilities when you kind of morph from one realm to another. Now that's not directly connected to the animals, but animals in my book also provide a kind of stability for a couple of characters. They are something of that net that
right.
That's an excellent point, Martha. And that's really, I much as I hate to veer away from this animal discussion, we have a lot of questions from our audience. And some of them have to do with animals. Some of them, curiously enough, have to do with politics. And I'm just going to read one to you. This is from Ruth Edgett in Ontario. In the formation of your novels, did you set out specifically to make social commentary? If so, how important is it for fiction to make us reflect upon the world in which we live, as opposed to creating a place for readers to escape from that world? I just, that strikes me as being very close to listening to the sound, the hum underneath.
Oh, I somebody asked me once why I didn't mention Trump by name. And I had to think about that. I think the reason is that I was trying to get, I think one way to comment on politics, cultural movements, everything, an effective way in fiction might be to try to create the feel of it rather than the data attached to it. And so I just wanted a sense of what I have felt in recent years conveyed, which is a sort of a heavy cloud, a sort of miasma, and a feeling of wanting to, that the powers that be are not on your side, and just that weight. And I feel like by being really explicit, at least for me, some people can do it really well in fiction and be very explicit and name names and voice very concrete complaints. But I was after the feel of it. I guess that's all I can say, is that I didn't want to analyze what has gone on, and I didn't want to line up enemies and shoot them necessarily, but I think that we've all felt a big weight of one kind or another, the combination of the political and cultural turmoil of the last few years, plus a pandemic, it's just, plus climate change. I mean, just these huge, huge, hard things that I don't actually feel capable of conveying with any authority. I just wanted to talk about try to talk a little bit about how it felt.
Well, and I think in the story you told and the time period in which you said it, you do that very wonderfully, capturing the feel that this moment with all of its attendant crises, really, the feel that it creates within specific people confronting their own specific private dramas. So it's never not there. Environmental crisis is never not very far from your characters in your book, to take just one example. My book is set in 2005. Wynn's girlfriend has been killed in Spain in the bombing in the Atocha station, which actually happened in 2003. And of course, 2001 is just a few years in back of that. So my book the action is at the beginning of, the 20-year period that is now, we're sort of bookending it, and the word that comes to my mind is just the sense of the precariousness of my characters' lives, financial, emotional, is a precariousness that I wanted the reader to sense was also very much affected by these political happenings, again, without analyzing them or making them the central dramas of my story. There's no way to understand Wynn and his alcoholism or his art without understanding what happened to his girlfriend and how it was, a function of larger forces, vectors of power and influence. That then zeroed in on one life and changed his. And so that, plus Blair's obsession with the Iraq War and the lies of our government around that gave Blair the impetus to do some of her work. So the question was about, it sort of seemed to our listeners' question seemed to sort of say, well, there can be escape or entertainment on the one hand and sort of clear focus on the other. And I do, like Deirdre, I do believe that there's a way in which fiction can expose without analyzing, can force a reckoning with without actually being overt in the addressing of these forces that are always in our lives, whether we want to attend to them or not, that shape our private dramas, whether we want to admit it or not.
Martha, thank you. And Deirdre, thank you. Those were both really good answers to that question, which of course dovetails with a question that we got from Ken Harvey, who is from Toronto and wanted to know how the present state of politics inform the politics of money inform your novels. And I think we've covered that. But what you're leading us to is something that's particularly poignant and of great heart interest. And it's the idea of empathy in your novels, and the idea of how did you, and Martha, you mentioned, the events in the early 2000s, and Deirdre, I know you're mentioning all these events that accrue as our bones start to melt. How do you settle on these events that cause grief? Cassie's grief, for example, in your novel, where she wants to do away with herself, or in Martha's novel, Blair's Torment. How do you find these events, and how do the grieving characters then connect or not connect with other people in their lives? How do they work that? And is it a shared grief? These are questions I've been thinking about a lot.
That's a tough one, Kat. I would say just one advantage of that both Martha and I had in taking a while to finish these books was you live with these characters for a long time. So, for instance, he's kind of a minor character, but a retired professor who lives in this apartment building. And when I was first writing about him, I didn't have any empathy for him. In fact, I would think I was sort of angry at certain aspects of academia and pompousness, and I was targeting him. I was using him. I was making him ridiculous, and I had to go a couple more years beyond the time that I had really put him together the first time. To see his sadness, I had to just live with it, live with him a little longer. And then it became impossible to just sort of make a cardboard character out of him and throw him down on the sidewalk. It's also just a good rule, I think, in characterization, is to make characters as complicated as they'll bear. I mean, there's nothing very interesting about an all bad or all good character, finally. And so I think that for those two reasons, the fact that I came to know I was taking cheap shots, which I don't respect when I read them elsewhere, and that I sort of knew more after just staying with him, changed that particular character, and I felt better about him. He's still half ridiculous, but not as ridiculous as he was.
He's a marvelous character, and the work that you did really shines through. And that's probably a really great note to sort of bring this whole conversation home. That spending more time with. This is sort of, I said it when Deirdre and I were talking initially, it's like, let's go for long haul novels, the ones that really do take that extra time. We're trained to think, oh, you've got to pump it out in a couple of years. Well, no, the discovery of those complications that elicit empathy takes time in life, takes time in fiction. And the fiction becomes, I think, more burnished, it gleams more when that time is allowed to pass and that living with is allowed to happen. So I think that's a lovely way to sort of close out what we've been sharing tonight.
That is a lovely way to close it out. And this idea of empathy has been running through everything that we've talked about, as well as the idea of place and the power and position of money, incredulity, and being the idea of credibility in all of this. These are two really beautiful novels that present characters that you may not know, but you know them. And if you don't know them, you will get to know them and you will love them. I strongly recommend both books to all of the people who have attended tonight. If you haven't had a chance to purchase the books, go out and buy them. Father's Day is coming up. Go ahead, go for it. And purchase a good book for the whoever is a father in your life. And I want to thank everyone for attending this event. There will be a recording. We'll post it on our website. And a special thanks to Martha and to Deirdre for taking time out of their day or their evening to be with us this evening. We still have lots of questions for you, but our readers will find you on Facebook or Instagram or Twitter or one of those marvelous, marvelous social media platforms. So thank you, everyone. And I wish you all the best. Thanks so much for coming.
Thank you.
Thank you, Pat. Thank you, Martha. Hope to see you both in person before too long.
Me too. Me too.
Thank you, everybody, for tuning in.
Yes. Have a lovely evening.
Okay.
And
Thank you, everybody.
Max. Thanks, Max.
Bye now.